Okay, now we are moving on to a different theory about ethics, deontology, according to which the rightness of an action depends on the intrinsic nature of the action. So, stealing is inherently wrong regardless of its consequences, good or bad. Recall that, according to consequentialism, the rightness of an action depends on the consequences of the action. So stealing may be right in certain cases and is wrong in other circumstances, depending on its consequences. Now, here's one way to put the difference between the two. According to consequentialism, the only thing that is good in itself is happiness, right? Do you still remember that? So, happiness, pleasure, is good as an end, not as a means. But according to the ontology, the, the only thing that's good is goodwill. The only thing that's good in itself as an end rather than as a means is goodwill rather than happiness. And it is the intrinsic nature of stealing that there is no goodwill in stealing. We'll get to that point shortly. But according to Kant, the only thing that's good in itself is goodwill. Again, goodwill is the only thing that can be called good without qualification. That is, the only thing that's absolutely good is not good relative to one thing or other. In other words, goodwill is the only thing that's good in itself, independently of any other things. Many other things may be good as a means. Alright, so for example, intelligence, courage, resolution, and so on and so forth. But they are never good in themselves. Why? Because they may also become extremely bad if the will is not good. So, according to Kant, according to the ontology, even happiness is not good in itself. So, this is the huge difference between the ontology and utilitarianism. So, a goodwill is good in itself, independent of its consequence. This this is contrary to what utilitarianism maintains. You may wonder, is the will to help others good? So, for example, could the action stealing be good if by stealing we can help others? If the will to steal, if the will to the will of stealing is to help others, could that justify stealing? Well, according to Kant, it cannot. Why not? Because the will is good only when it is done from duty. What does that mean? In order to understand that, let's firstly consider the following four conditions, the following four situations. So there are actions that conflict with duty. There are actions that conform to duty but are done from a selfish view. There are actions that accord with duty but are done from direct inclination. And there are actions done from duty and nothing else. And only this kind of actions um, can be considered as involving goodwill. Okay, so the first kind, actions that conflict with duty, like lying. Lying conflicts with the duty of being honest. So obviously, lying is morally wrong. The second kind of actions that conform to duty but are done from a selfish view, um, like for example, it is always a matter of duty that a dealer should not overcharge inexperienced buyers. Suppose there is a dealer who keeps a fixed price for everyone for reputation in order to get a good business. In this case, the dealer's action, even though conforms to duty, it is, after all, done from a selfish view, right? So in this case, the dealer's action has no moral worth. It's the dealer's action is not morally praiseworthy because the dealer is doing so from a selfish view. The dealer's motivation is selfish. It's not the motivation of the dealer is not to do something from duty. The third, there are actions that accord with duty but are done from direct inclination, like um, maintaining one's life. It is a duty to maintain one's life according to Kant. However, most people have such direct inclination to maintain one's life, so to speak. For most of us, maintaining our lives is a kind of direct inclination, right? So we preserve our lives as duty requires, but not because duty requires. So in this case, our action has no moral worth. Okay, so it's just a coincidence that what the duty urges us to do is the same as what our direct inclination wants us to do. Okay, so even though we are doing something, but that's from our inclination, not from our duty. Okay, so only when an action is done from duty alone and nothing else, it can be considered as being done from um, goodwill. But in what kind of situation an action can be considered as being done from duty alone? Well, Taking the same example into account, maintaining one's life. Suppose there's a person um, who is really miserable in every way. Okay, the person does not have um, a job, has no place to stay, has no friends, has no money, has nothing. And the person really wants to die because there's no hope in his life. There's no hope in the world for him or she or her. So the person really wants to die. But according to the duty of maintaining one's life, the person chooses to preserve his or her own life. In this case, the person's preserving one's life has a moral worth. Okay, even though the person really wants to die, but the person chooses to preserve one's life. Only in this case, preserving one's life is morally praiseworthy. Here is here is another example of actions done from direct inclination. To be beneficent when we can is a duty. However, many people are so sympathetic that they find a pleasure in spreading joy around them without any other motive of self-interest. Such action is done from direct inclination, but not from duty, and therefore has no moral worth. So, only when a man has no sympathy at all, but has the power to benefit others in distress, by which he is not touched at all, the person has the goodwill, has the goodwill. Only in this case, the action is done from duty, and the action has genuine moral worth. Another example is this: to secure one's own happiness, according to Kant, is also a duty. If the general desire for happiness did not influence one's will, then one's promoting one's happiness is not from inclination, but from duty, and hence acquires true moral worth. Okay, so in other words, it's our job, it's our duty to promote our happiness, but we'll have to do so without feeling any happiness, without feeling any pleasure, or at least we promote our happiness not because we feel good about it, not because we have good feeling, we have pleasure of it. Okay, so moral worthy morally worthy actions are done from duty because they are done without regard to the purposes for any consequence, such as any form of pleasure or happiness, right? Purposes or their effects, regarded as ends and springs of the will, cannot give the action any unconditional or moral worth. So here's the complete notion of duty. An action done from duty must wholly exclude the influence of inclination, and every object of the will with that inclination, so that the will is determined by objectively the law, subjectively pure respect for this law, and, consequently the maxim that I should follow this law, even to the hindering of all my inclinations. Okay? So let's summarize what is being said. What is goodwill? Well, a will is good if and only if one wills to act from duty. What is duty? An action is done from duty if and only if the action is done from respect for the law. Okay? So this is goodwill, this is bad will. But what is law? According to Kant, a universal moral law has three forms or three requirements, necessary conditions. The first requirement or first form of a universal moral law is that it has to be a categorical imperative. Okay? Universal moral laws are expressed in the form of categorical imperatives. But what is a categorical imperative? We can compare that to a hypothetical imperative, which is a command to do something with conditions restricting it. Okay, imperative is a command. A hypothetical imperative is a command with qualification, with conditions restricting the command. For example, this is a hypothetical imperative. If you want good reputation, help people, help others. In comparison, a categorical imperative is a command to do something without any qualification, without any condition restricting the command. So, for example, tell the truth, period. Help people, period. Okay? So, just tell the truth without any qualification, without any conditions. Just help people without any qualification. Okay? So, a command like these are categorical imperatives. Why are universal moral laws categorical imperatives? Because whatever has the highest value cannot be qualified, cannot be conditioned, right? If a thing has a value relative to a condition, relative to a qualification, then the goodness in this case is merely relative rather than absolute. Okay, so if a thing is absolutely good, it cannot be qualified, it cannot be conditioned. Okay, so for example, if you want good pay, work hard. So working hard is valuable only when you want a good pay. So working hard is not absolutely desirable, valuable. Working hard is just a means to an end. It's not itself an end. It's not itself desirable, good in itself, right? It is why not? Why not? Because in this case, working hard is always accompanied by a condition, by a qualification. For another example, if you want to be a scientist, seek the truth. Again, this qualification is not adequate because seeking the truth is valuable in every situation, right? At least to most of us, seeking the truth is good in itself. It's absolutely good, desirable. So just seek the truth, period. No matter what, just see the truth. Okay, so the second requirement, the second form of a universal moral law is that um, a universal moral law has to be able to subjectively accept it. That is, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So to speak, a universal law is such that you can consistently, without contradiction, will that law to be a universal law applicable to everyone. Okay? That is, you can subjectively accept that the law applies to everyone, including yourself, without any contradiction. Okay? So this requirement is called subjective acceptance. For example, can this categorical imperative be a universal moral law? You should lie. Although this command is absolute, it's without any qualification. It's a categorical imperative. But you certainly do not want this maxim to be applicable to everyone, including yourself, right? You certainly do not want to be lied about anything, right? So in this case, this categorical imperative cannot be a universal moral law because it cannot pass the second requirement, the subjective acceptance. Another example which cannot pass the second requirement would be a false promise. Suppose you need to borrow money from a friend, but you know that you could never pay your friend back. So, in order to get a loan, you decide to lie, falsely promising to repay the money. In this case, you may follow this maxim: make a lying promise to repay. But the question is, can you will this maxim to be applicable to everyone without contradiction? Whenever you need to borrow money, you cannot pay back. You follow this maxim. Is that possible? No, because there is a contradiction. Promise with the purpose of not keeping the promise makes the promise itself impossible, right? If just It's just pointless to make a promise if your intention is to break the promise, right? So making a lying promise cannot be a universal moral law because it cannot be uh, subjectively accepted without contradiction. Here is another example, but I'm going to skip this explanation. Okay, so the final requirement for a universal moral law, the third form of a universal moral law, is the principle of respect for persons. That is, act in such a way that you always treat humanity whenever in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So here you can see a close relationship between this requirement and the first. So a, hypo, a hypothetical imperative indicates a means to an end. If if you are sick, if you are sick, go to see a doctor. So why do you see a doctor? Because you're sick. To see a doctor is a means to an end. What end? To get healed. But a categorical imperative indicates an end because it is not qualified in any way. Like help others. You just help others. Why? Because you are in this case you are not treating people. You are not treating people as a means to an end. Okay? You just treat people um, as an end. Okay? You just help people because you treat people as an end rather than a means to an end. So in this case, this command is a categorical imperative. It's without any qualification. And at the same time, it indicates respect for humanity, for people. Now, what's a possible objection to the ontology, to Kant's ethics. Well, consider this case. A band of killers wants to murder an innocent person who has taken refuge in your house, and the killer come to your door and ask you point blank if the person is in your house. What would you do? What should you do? What is the morally right thing to do in this case? I think most of us would say, no, make a lie, right? That's absolutely the right thing to do, to make a lie. Therefore, Kant's theory is not consistent with our moral common sense. Because obviously, tell the truth is the universal moral law, according to Kant. But in this case, we should not follow this universal moral law. Well, in this case, it's certainly not a universal moral law, right? Here is another objection. Consider this. I'm a Taiwanese, right? And I'm so inclined that I will the maxim enslave all Taiwanese to be a universal moral law, applicable to everyone, including myself. Is this maxim really morally permissible? Well, let's think about it. Let's see if this maxim passes the three requirements. Well, it's certainly a categorical imperative, right? And I truly, subjectively will this maxim to be a universal moral law, consistently applicable to everyone, including myself. So it passes. It satisfies the second requirement. What about the third? By doing so, by will so, am I respecting humanities? Am I treating humanities as an end? Well, I believe so, because I'm not treating anyone as a means to anything. I simply think that's a universal moral law. Everyone should follow this, because that's for humanity, right? Given that I really believe so. But intuitively, this cannot be right. So again, Kantian ethics may sometimes violate our moral common sense. So this apparent arbitrariness of the second formulation significantly lessen Kant's theory's usefulness. Okay, so that's all for Kantian ethics. Now here's the discussion topic for the week. It's the same case as the last week, but the question, the task, is a bit different. So in this case, what would Kant's theory urge us to do? Explain why. And what is the categorical imperative in this case? And finally, Do you agree with Kant's theory in this case? Explain why or why